Imagine this. It's August 9th, 1965. Singapore wakes up to shocking news. It is no longer part of Malaysia. The Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew appears on television. His voice shakes. His eyes fill with tears. He says, "For me, it is a moment of anguish. All my life, I believed in the merger with Malaysia. Now we are separated. A tiny island, no natural resources, no army strong enough to defend itself, surrounded by bigger neighbors who weren't always friendly." Everyone thought Singapore was finished, but instead of collapsing, this little island turned into one of the richest, safest, and most advanced countries in the world. So here's the big question. Why did Singapore survive after breaking from Malaysia, when so many believed it wouldn't? Let's dive deep. Chapter 1. Why Singapore joined Malaysia in the first place. Before independence, Singapore was a small British colony sitting at the edge of the Malay Peninsula. It had one great advantage, a busy port that connected east and west. But behind the bustling harbor, the reality was far less glamorous. Poverty was everywhere. Unemployment was high. Overcrowded slums bred disease and unrest. The island looked modern from the outside, but inside it was fragile. By the late 1950s, Singaporeans wanted more control over their own future. They believed the answer lay in joining a larger nation, Malaysia. For leaders like Lee Kuan Yew, merger seemed not just desirable, but essential. The reasons were clear. Economic survival. Singapore had no natural resources, no farmland to feed its people, no oil to sell, no minerals to mine. Malaysia, however, had rubber, tin, palm oil, and land. Joining meant access to a wider market and the hope of shared prosperity. Political stability. The Cold War was raging, and communism was spreading across Southeast Asia. Singapore's leaders feared communist influence among its Chinese-educated working class. They hoped merger with Malaysia would bring stronger security against this threat. Cultural ties. Geography and history already linked them. Many families had members on both sides of the causeway. Malay, Chinese, and Indian communities flowed across borders. A political union seemed natural. So in 1963, Singapore formally merged with Malaysia. On paper, it looked like the perfect partnership. Two territories bound by trade, culture, and security. But beneath the surface, tensions were already brewing. Chapter 2. Why Singapore was kicked out. The dream of merger quickly turned into a nightmare. Almost as soon as Singapore joined Malaysia in 1963, cracks began to appear in the union. The first and biggest issue was ethnic tension. Singapore's population was nearly 75% Chinese, while Malaysia's federal government was dominated by Malays. The Malaysian leaders pushed for a policy of special rights for Malays, preferential treatment in education, jobs, and business. Lee Kuan Yew and his party in Singapore, however, argued for a Malaysian Malaysia, where all races would be treated equally. This disagreement struck at the very heart of national identity, fueling resentment on both sides. Then came economic rivalry. Instead of opening markets, Malaysia imposed taxes on Singaporean goods. Leaders in Kuala Lumpur feared Singapore's booming port and business community would overshadow their own economy. What was supposed to be a partnership turned into competition, with each side trying to outmaneuver the other. Tensions spilled into the streets. In 1964, racial riots erupted in Singapore after political rallies turned violent. Malays and Chinese clashed, homes were burned, shops looted, at least 36 people were killed, and more than 500 injured. The riots left deep scars and convinced many leaders that peaceful coexistence under one flag was impossible. By mid-1965, Malaysia's Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman, made a drastic choice to cut Singapore loose. On August 9, 1965, Malaysia's parliament voted overwhelmingly to expel Singapore. Singapore had not fought for independence. It was quite literally thrown out. Chapter 3. The tiny island nobody believed in. Now picture this. On the morning of August 9, 1965, Singapore became the world's newest nation. Yet almost no one believed it would last. The island was barely 700 square kilometers, smaller than many cities. It had no oil, no minerals, not even enough land to grow its own food. To make matters worse, even its water supply came from Malaysia, the very country that had just expelled it. The military was almost non-existent. Singapore had only a few thousand men armed with basic rifles, and its defense still relied heavily on the shrinking presence of British forces. For a young nation in a region full of territorial disputes, That was terrifying. Economically, the situation was grim. Unemployment hovered near 14%, and thousands of young people entered the workforce each year with no jobs waiting for them. Overcrowded slums stretched across the island, breeding disease, crime, and despair. The outside world didn't hide its doubts. Foreign diplomats quietly whispered that Singapore would become a failed state, perhaps forced to crawl back to Malaysia or fall under communist influence. International newspapers painted the island as an orphan nation destined for collapse. Even Singapore's own Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, admitted in interviews that he wept in private, unsure if his fragile nation could survive. And yet, what seemed like a death sentence became the beginning of an incredible transformation. Instead of collapsing, Singapore chose to reinvent itself. Chapter 4. Leadership that changed everything. At the heart of Singapore's survival story was Lee Kuan Yew and the small team of leaders around him. They were not dreamers lost in idealism. They were hard-nosed realists, tough, disciplined, practical. Every decision they made was driven by one question: how do we keep Singapore alive? Instead of mourning what the island lacked, land, oil, or water, they zeroed in on what it did have. A strategic location at the crossroads of world trade, where ships from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia passed daily. A disciplined and hardworking people, willing to adapt, sacrifice, and learn quickly. A clean political slate, free from the racial and political struggles that plagued Malaysia. Lee broke survival down into 3 urgent priorities. First, security. Without an army, Singapore could be crushed at any time. Building a defense force was non-negotiable. Second, jobs. With unemployment rising, Lee knew that without work, the young nation would face unrest. Foreign investment had to be attracted and industries had to be built fast. Third, unity. The racial riots of 1964 were still fresh in everyone's memory. If Malays, Chinese, and Indians turned on each other again, Singapore would rip apart before it even began. This 3-part plan, security, jobs, and unity, was simple, but it became the survival blueprint. Guided by leaders who refused to accept failure, Singapore would now attempt what many thought was impossible: to turn a tiny, vulnerable island into a strong and stable nation. Chapter 5. Building an army from nothing. On the day Singapore became independent, it had no real army to defend itself. Security was still in the hands of British troops stationed on the island, but everyone knew they wouldn't stay forever. Without its own defense, Singapore was dangerously exposed. A single hostile move from a neighbor could have ended the nation before it even began. Lee Kuan Yew understood this grim reality. His conclusion was simple but urgent. Singapore must build an army, fast. The solution was national service. Every young man was required to serve in the armed forces. It was not a popular policy at first. Many families feared losing sons to war or hardship. But Lee insisted that survival demanded sacrifice. National service soon became a rite of passage, shaping not just soldiers, but citizens who understood discipline, duty, and unity. To accelerate progress, Singapore turned to an unlikely mentor, Israel. Like Singapore, Israel was a small nation surrounded by larger, sometimes hostile neighbors. Its military advisors trained Singapore's first officers, helped design strategies, and taught the young country how to defend itself despite its size. Within just a few years, Singapore transformed its defense from almost nothing into one of the most efficient and modern armed forces in Asia. Soldiers trained hard, technology was prioritized, and discipline was unmatched. The message was clear to the world: we may be small, but we are not weak. Chapter 6. Turning foreign companies into lifelines. Singapore faced a brutal truth in 1965. It had no oil wells to drill, no gold to mine, no fields to feed its people. Survival meant finding another way to earn a living. For Lee Kuan Yew, the answer was bold and simple: invite the world in. He and his team rolled out the red carpet for foreign companies. They promised stability, reliable laws, low taxes, and most importantly, no corruption. In a region where business deals often depended on bribes or political favors, Singapore offered something rare: honesty and efficiency. Global giants noticed. Companies like Shell and Exxon built refineries. Hewlett-Packard set up electronics factories. Shipyards expanded, and new industries were born. For ordinary Singaporeans, this was life-changing. Thousands of jobs appeared almost overnight. Young workers gained skills in engineering, manufacturing, and management. Wages rose. Families that once lived in slums began to climb into the middle class. But Lee's strategy wasn't just about jobs, it was about transformation. He wanted Singapore to move from being just a trading port to becoming a global industrial hub. By linking itself to multinational corporations, Singapore tied its economy directly to the engines of global trade. The gamble paid off. Instead of being dependent on Malaysia's markets, Singapore became connected to the entire world. This shift was the foundation of the island's economic miracle. What was once seen as a weakness, no resources, became its greatest strength, flexibility and openness. Chapter 7: Fighting Corruption and Building Trust. For many newly independent nations, corruption became the silent killer of progress. Leaders enriched themselves, public money vanished, and foreign investors stayed away. But Singapore chose a different path, one that shocked the world. Lee Kuan Yew believed corruption was a cancer that could destroy his fragile nation, so he attacked it with ruthless determination. The government passed strict anti-corruption laws and empowered the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, CPIB, to go after anyone, no matter how powerful. No minister, no official, no businessman was untouchable. At the same time, Lee did something radical. He decided that politicians and top civil servants should be paid salaries comparable to the private sector. His reasoning was simple. If you want honest leaders, you must remove the temptation to steal. While controversial, this policy meant Singapore attracted some of the best minds into public service without fear of corruption. The courts were kept independent, and the police were given the authority to enforce the law fairly. Slowly but surely, Singapore built a reputation as a country where rules actually worked. Foreign investors noticed. In Asia, where contracts were often broken or delayed by bureaucracy, Singapore stood out. Companies knew that in Singapore, a deal signed was a deal kept. This trust became Singapore's invisible wealth. While other nations struggled under corruption, Singapore rose above it, proving that integrity itself could be turned into an economic resource. Chapter 8: Housing the Nation. In the 1960s, Singapore's housing crisis was severe. The majority of citizens lived in cramped, unsafe slums with leaking roofs, shared toilets, and little access to clean water. Fires swept through wooden shacks, leaving families homeless overnight. Disease spread easily, and poverty hung heavy over entire neighborhoods. For a new nation trying to survive, this was more than a housing issue. It was a matter of dignity and stability. Lee Kuan Yew's government moved quickly. In 1960, it created the Housing Development Board, HDB, with one mission: to give every Singaporean a safe and modern home. Unlike many governments that made promises but never delivered, the HDB worked with military efficiency. Blocks of apartments were built at record speed, each equipped with running water, proper sanitation, and electricity. The results were dramatic. Families who once shared a single room now had their own flats. Children grew up in clean, secure environments instead of dangerous slums. By the 1980s, more than 80% of Singaporeans lived in HDB housing. Today, that figure is above 90%, making Singapore one of the highest rates of public homeownership in the world. But the genius of HDB was not just in shelter, it was in nation building. Flats were designed so families of different races lived side by side, breaking down barriers and preventing the segregation that often fuels unrest. In Singapore, housing became more than brick and mortar. It became a tool for unity, pride, and harmony. Chapter 9: Education as a Weapon. Singapore had no oil to sell, no mines to dig, no vast farmland to feed its people. But Lee Kuan Yew saw one treasure the island did have: its people. If natural resources were absent, then Singaporeans themselves would have to become the nation's greatest resource. The government invested heavily in education from the ground up. Primary schools were expanded, secondary schools multiplied, and technical institutes were established to prepare workers for industries that had yet to exist. Later, world-class universities were built, producing engineers, doctors, and entrepreneurs who could compete globally. Perhaps the most revolutionary decision was to make English the common language. In a country split between Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities, English was the neutral choice. It united people across racial lines, reduced mistrust, and gave every Singaporean access to the language of global trade, science, and technology. At the same time, mother tongues were preserved, Chinese, Malay, and Tamil remained compulsory, so no community lost its roots. This approach created a generation that was bilingual, disciplined, and highly skilled. They could speak to the world in English while keeping their cultural identities intact. The result? By the 1970s and 80s, Singapore's workforce was not only cheap compared to the West, but also educated and efficient. Investors flooded in, knowing they could find reliable, world-class workers on this small island. In a world where resources run out, Singapore had forged a renewable gold mine. Human capital. Chapter 10. Clean and green. When people thought of survival in the 1960s, they imagined jobs, food, and defense. Few leaders would have placed beauty on that list. But Lee Kuan Yew saw something others missed. If Singapore was to attract investors and tourists, it had to look like a place worth trusting. He launched a massive clean and green campaign. Streets were scrubbed, drains cleared, and strict anti-littering laws were introduced. Chewing gum was even banned to keep public spaces spotless. It was not about being fussy. It was about building discipline into everyday life. At the same time, Lee started nationwide tree planting drives. Empty lots were filled with parks, roadsides lined with shade trees, and gardens built into urban neighborhoods. Slowly, the gray, crowded island transformed into a lush, orderly environment. By the 1970s, Singapore earned the nickname the Garden City. Travelers arriving at Changi Airport were greeted not by pollution and chaos, as in many growing cities, but by palm trees, orchids, and spotless streets. This wasn't just cosmetic. A clean, green city created confidence. Investors felt their money was safe in a place that looked organized and disciplined. Tourists returned home impressed, telling stories of a city that sparkled with order. And ordinary Singaporeans felt pride in living in a country that valued harmony, not just survival. Singapore proved that sometimes survival isn't just about strength, it's about creating an environment where people and businesses want to belong. Chapter 11. Water, the biggest weakness. If Singapore had one fatal weakness in 1965, it was water. The island had no natural lakes, no great rivers, and very little underground supply. Almost all of its drinking water came through pipelines from Malaysia. This dependence was a ticking time bomb. At any moment, political tension could threaten the taps. Without water, factories would shut down, homes would go dry, and the entire nation could grind to a halt. Lee Kuan Yew understood this vulnerability all too well. He often described water as a matter of national survival. So, the government made water security a top priority. Step by step, they reduced reliance on Malaysia. Reservoirs were expanded, catchment areas created, and every drop was carefully managed. Then came innovation. Singapore pioneered water recycling, turning used water into ultra-clean drinking water branded as New Water. At first, people were skeptical, but strict testing and public education changed minds. Next, the country invested in desalination plants, pulling fresh water directly from the sea. Today, these systems form the 4 national taps: local catchments, imported water, New Water, and desalination. Together, they ensure a steady supply even in times of drought or crisis. What was once Singapore's greatest weakness became a symbol of resilience and ingenuity. Instead of being hostage to geography, Singapore showed the world that even water scarcity can be defeated with discipline and innovation. Chapter 12. From Third World to First World. In the mid-1960s, Singapore was written off as just another struggling post-colonial state. Its GDP per capita was on par with Ghana, Jamaica, and other developing nations. Poverty was widespread, unemployment was high, and many international observers predicted the tiny island would never escape the third world trap. Fast forward just a few decades, and the transformation is almost unbelievable. Today, Singapore's GDP per capita rivals that of Switzerland, the United States, and Norway. From a swampy trading post with overcrowded slums, it became a city of glittering skyscrapers, world-class universities, and one of the busiest airports and seaports on Earth. The shift was not luck. It was the result of discipline, planning, and vision. Every policy, from housing to education to economic openness, was designed with one purpose: survival. And survival evolved into prosperity. By the 1980s, Singapore was recognized as one of the Asian tigers alongside Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea, nations that achieved rapid growth through industrialization and innovation. But Singapore stood out. It had no resources, no hinterland, and yet it managed to create one of the most competitive economies in the world. The story is often described as nothing short of a miracle, but in truth, it was not magic. It was willpower, and it all began on that fateful day in 1965 when Singapore was cast out of Malaysia and forced to build its destiny alone. Chapter 13: Why Singapore Survived When Others Failed. Looking back, the question remains, why did Singapore succeed when so many believed it was doomed? The first answer lies in leadership. Lee Kuan Yew and his team were not just politicians, they were nation builders. They combined discipline with long-term vision, refusing quick fixes in favor of strategies that would last for generations. Second, Singapore turned its geography into an advantage. Sitting at one of the busiest sea lanes in the world, it positioned itself as a global hub for trade, aviation, and finance. What could have been just a small dot on the map became a gateway to Asia. Third, Singapore built global connections. Instead of depending on its immediate neighbors, it opened its doors to the entire world. Multinational companies, foreign investors, and global talent became partners in its growth. Fourth, it maintained unity and discipline. Strict laws prevented chaos, while racial harmony was carefully nurtured through housing, education, and national service. A nation once divided found strength in diversity. Fifth, Singapore invested in its people. Education and housing weren't just policies, they were weapons of survival, giving every citizen a stake in the nation's success. Finally, Singapore enforced a zero-tolerance policy on corruption. While many young countries collapsed under weak governance, Singapore became known as one of the cleanest and most reliable places to do business. Singapore did not survive by accident. It survived because survival itself became the plan. Every decision, every sacrifice, every law pointed to one goal: to prove the doubters wrong. Conclusion: the lesson of Singapore. When Singapore was expelled from Malaysia in 1965, it was seen by many as a death sentence. How could a tiny island with no water, no oil, and no army possibly survive on its own? Even its own leaders doubted the nation's future. And yet, what looked like the end was really the beginning of one of history's greatest comeback stories. Singapore proved that survival does not depend on the size of your land or the wealth of your soil. It depends on the strength of your people, the honesty of your leaders, and the courage to turn weakness into opportunity. The lesson? You don't need vast natural resources to succeed. You need vision, discipline, and trust. Singapore's story is living proof that even the smallest of nations can rise to global power if they refuse to give up. In less than a lifetime, it went from slums and uncertainty to skyscrapers, stability, and success admired by the entire world. It is not just the story of Singapore, it is a story of human resilience. So now I'll leave you with a question. Do you think Singapore would have been better off if it had stayed in Malaysia? Or did being forced out give it the freedom to thrive? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more untold stories of nations, history, and survival.